Hi, my name is Bill Norton, and at the time I wrote these slides back in 2007, my day job was at Equinix, where I spent 90% of my time working with the customer base, identifying areas of strategic alignment, and trying to find ways to pull these various communities together. I was also an elected member of the first NANOG Steering Committee, an organization I will discuss in a minute. So, what qualifies me to talk about NANOG history? I worked at Merit for 11 years, working on the NSFNet backbone, the precursor to the modern Internet. During my last few years at Merit, I chaired NANOG and created the first NANOG business plan. I take pride in starting some of the early NANOG traditions, including numbering NANOGs, NANOG 11, NANOG 12, NANOG 13, etc. I started the tradition of giving away NANOG t-shirts, something not budgeted for when NSF was funding these meetings. I started the tradition of beer and gear, a way of obtaining some commercial funding without NANOG becoming a full-blown trade show. Most notably, though, I started the tradition of documenting the disturbing and ever-increasing costs of obtaining cookies for the NANOG community, also known as the cookie graph. At the time, we outgrew having universities host NANOG and migrated into hotels, where the cost per cookie rocketed to over $2 per cookie. Finally, I left behind the legacy of using NANOG surveys to identify where NANOG was serving the interests of the participants and where it was not. Since the early NANOG days, when travel budgets were mostly funded by the National Science Foundation, Merit tried to spread the travel burden widely across the participants, so travel expenses did not fall too much on any individual organization. Merit used local hosts to arrange the local logistics, like identifying a good venue or a hotel for the meeting, making sure that the connectivity was in place, that a regional airport was reasonably close, etc. This distributed venue strategy has proven successful, but fraught with challenges over the years. In almost all cases, the hosts have come through and done a great job handling all the logistics, so that Merit NANOG support staff could focus only on the internal meeting issues, such as registration, speakers, and agenda coordination, and making sure that the rooms were set up properly and paying for cookies and coffee, etc. But in a few cases, the local host wanted to host NANOG, but ultimately was too busy to handle the workload, or was unresponsive, or otherwise did not provide the solid base upon which a NANOG can be placed, so the venue had to be moved. The community has always stepped up to the plate, and there have always been alternative hosts willing and able to help out in a pinch, which is a testament, I think, to the value the community sees in the NANOG venue. In the early days, back when dinosaurs ran the Internet core called the NSFNet, there was a contract awarded to Merit to build and operate the new T1, that's a whopping 1.54 megabit per second NSFNet, with plans to migrate this Internet core to a whopping T3, 45 megabit per second core, to interconnect the NSF-funded regional networks across the U.S., as shown in the picture here. As part of this contract, Merit was to assemble the relevant regional network technicians to discuss the backbone core operations and performance activities as seen from both the core of the NSFNet as well as from the tributary NSFNet regional networks perspectives. So we used the regional text meetings to serve this function. The NSF funded Merit to provide logistics support for the meetings, assemble a useful agenda, and work with local hosts as appropriate, as stated before, to make sure that no one was unduly burdened with travel expenses. This worked during the contract term from 1987 to 1994, when the Internet growth had led NSF to the conclusion that the Internet no longer required government funding and could be grown as an entirely commercial endeavor. One of my first tasks as part of this transition away from NSF funding was to build a business model for the commercial version of the regional text meetings, called the North American Network Operators Group, NANOG, a name created by Elise Garrick and Mark Knopper, reflective of the broader non-AUP nature of the new Internet core. In this model, I named myself NANOG Chair, and set the agenda with help of much smarter people than me. We asked the community for hosts to volunteer to provide hotel and network, and Merit used the $150 registration fee now required to offset the local host hotel costs, to pay for my silly NANOG t-shirts, to sysadmin the NANOG mailing list and the website, etc. With this new business model, we covered the costs of the NANOG operations without government funding, and NANOG indeed continued to grow. I called this model the strong chair NANOG model because as NANOG chair I could pretty much do what I thought the community wanted in terms of agenda, logistics, location, and timing, etc. When people complained about the content, I recruited them to help me recruit agenda items, to volunteer to speak, but when it came down to it, I ultimately, as the strong chair, made the decisions. For my chair, it was good to be able to override the sometimes conservative group think volunteer program committee that in order to try different things. In 1998, I left Merit to help start Equinix, and a set of NANOG chairs from Merit stepped up to the task, each continuing the strong chair model. One of these NANOG chairs was not quite as responsive to the community as was required, and perhaps applied a bit too much pressure on some activities, such as mailing list administration. There were some bannings here. And at NANOG commercial activities, such as vendor-logoed underwear, and applied too much pressure on these activities. For a variety of reasons, the community reached a tipping point that started a movement to restructure NANOG to be the community's NANOG, not an activity that Merit ran entirely as they saw fit. I call this the NANOG Revolution. The goals of this movement were to provide NANOG with transparency to the broader NANOG community, accountability, a better agenda, but fundamentally to make sure that NANOG was more community-driven and responsive to the needs of the evolving North American Internet. My benevolent dictator model was crumbling. So the model that was developed had an organization of volunteers from the community that included a set of 6 elected members from the community that were called the steering committee. The steering committee was tasked with, among other things, selecting a group of program committee members from the NANOG community and a set of mailing list administrators. No longer were these the sole purview of the Merit Strong NANOG chair. Here you can see the new organization shown graphically by this diagram. You see that the community elects a steering committee that selects a program committee and selects a mailing list administration group to create the agenda, and all of this is replacing the functionality of the strong program chair. Specifically, the end goals of the revolution were mostly achieved. The community has more visibility into the activities behind NANOG, with steering committee meeting minutes being posted, and a recurring venue called the community meeting, where issues can be brought up and discussed with the organization behind NANOG. We have learned that alcohol served before the meeting has the expected consequences. As for accountability, the community has the right to elect or not re-elect steering committee members, and the term limits prevent the status quo from continuing indefinitely, and in effect require periodic new blood into the organization. As for actual results, I think it's worth pointing out that this experiment in self-governance was not without failings, and we should recognize and document, even celebrate, that we didn't get everything right the first time. For example, with this model, when does Merit need to involve the steering committee? When the steering committee doesn't know something, they don't know that they don't know it, because all this information is inside of Merit. This is a fundamental failure in this advisory role that the steering committee plays. There are also lots of information details regarding selection of host, location, and the number of meetings per year, to name a few. Should Merit just do what they normally do, or should they actively seek the steering committee for opinions? At times, to Merit, it might seem like the steering committee is dangerously close to micromanaging them, but to the steering committee, it might seem like we don't have enough information to do this job. With the steering committee oversight of the program committee, how does the steering committee get enough information to know who should be reappointed and who should not? One view is that the steering committee member participating on the program committee should advise the steering committee on this. But if that were the case, then why not have that steering committee member make this determination alone? What value does the broader steering committee have when they have zero visibility into the internal workings of the program committee? Anyway, these are open questions. In any case, this was a brief overview of what has happened in the past 10 years of NANOG evolution, from 1987 through 1990.